Here's your hat back. Nice. Exam? No, not anytime soon. It's like 2 or 3 weeks away. All right, it's 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, today is chapter 4. So after today, we're going to be 1/4 of the way through our book. Somebody asked if there's an exam coming up. There is an exam coming up in like 3 weeks. Not super close, but after chapter 8, we'll do our exam for the midterm. I think that's earlier than a lot of your other midterms. Is that correct? It's like early October. All right, well, just so you know, my midterm is not hard. And I think it'll benefit y'all to not have to worry about that when you're doing your other midterms. So we'll get out of the way, and then we'll be halfway done with learning new stuff. We'll also reserve a day for a midterm review the day before we do our midterm, and also it's the same before the final. The day before the final, we'll spend the whole class period. We'll go through the study guide. I'll give y'all a study guide in advance. We'll as a team, we'll figure out where on the slides answers to questions are. So it should be pretty helpful, and everyone should do pretty well. Last semester, the average was a 86 on the midterm and like an 89 on the final. So it'd be not difficult to get an A. Okay, so let's jump into chapter 4. We're going to talk about global management today. So here are our learning objectives. Mike. All right, so 6 objectives for today. Number 1, identify 3 influential effects of globalization. We'll also define globalization in case we're not familiar with that term. We'll describe characteristics of a successful international manager, outline the ways in which companies can expand internationally, and we'll talk about why companies expand internationally, the benefits of doing so. Discuss barriers to free trade and ways companies try to overcome barriers to free trade. Explain the value to managers of understanding cultural differences, and then also try to develop our own cross-cultural competency. All right, so let's dive in. First section, we'll talk about globalization. So we'll kind of define it, talk about how it has led to a collapse in time and distance between organizations and between societies. We'll talk about how it increases competition, but also as a benefit to organizations. And then we'll talk about terms such as global village and global economy. What's up, Mari? All right. So there are some fun facts in the first part of this chapter in the book. They talk about competition between countries. And some of the stats they used to rank countries, number 1 is just the size of the economy. And for this, at least in 2019, the United States was the largest in the world. However, the book goes on to say that's not always the best metric of success in terms of growth and innovation and also happiness. There's other ways that we can measure competition between countries. One of them is, no, they don't say what this rank is. When they talk about competitiveness, US ranks number 2 behind Singapore. And that, when they think about competitiveness, is a broad term for a country that involves what are the policies in place within that country? Like what's the government saying that organizations should do? What's the structure that either supports or hinders organizations' growth and competitiveness in the global environment? Okay. Let me ask you all this. I don't think this was in the book. What would y'all say if you're looking at what country do I want to live in long term? Would y'all use another metric? So we got global economy, size of the economy, competitiveness. What would y'all choose when you're moving across the world? Amari? Work-life balance? That's a really good one. That's also really common. Say? Safety? Okay. Do y'all know good countries for work-life balance and safety? Japan, Spain. A lot of countries in Europe are good in terms of work-life balance, especially relative to the United States. Finland, I think this was last year, they said Finland is the happiest country in the world. And one part of that is their work-life balance, their social support. Okay, so just something to think about, that competition and economy is not always the best metric of who's the best. All right. Let's talk about global village and electronic commerce. This is a pretty important concept here, that globalization is a result of communication advances. So technological advances in communication. They say that the greatest civilizations are defined by their communications, that it allows us to transfer information instantly. It used to be we had to hand deliver like letters to get information across the world. It's very slow. But with the rise of telecommunications, like AT&T was a pioneer in developing the technology to talk over a phone. And also the internet was huge in making sure that, or allowing for information to spread really quickly. How does that benefit you if you're running an organization to have access to instant transfer of knowledge and access to information? What's the benefit there? Yeah, Mike. Yeah, advertising, that's a good example. I wasn't even thinking of that. You can advertise your product and you can advertise it across the world instantly. Put an ad on Facebook. Cool. All right. Let's keep going. Let's define globalization with the underlined word, although I don't remember if that's on the test or not, but it's good to know. All right, so it is the trend of world economies becoming increasingly interdependent. If you're not familiar with the term interdependent, I wasn't when I was in college. It just means that we rely on each other. It's more so used in the context within teams. Teams are interdependent of each other, teammates, like they need each other to be successful. They're applying this term to global societies. So now world economies are dependent on each other for resources, for example, to trade resources and to trade knowledge. Cool. So that is what globalization means. All these countries are now more interdependent of each other. There are a couple benefits and a couple drawbacks. So the one thing is that it allows small companies to get started faster. So if you want to sell products on Amazon, it's not hard to do at all. You just post products on Amazon, and then now you're a business. You could sell things online. You have access instantly to the whole world. Every consumer in the world now has access to your products. That's great if you're trying to sell things. A couple downsides. There's thinking about it from the scale of a government. Some things they don't like about globalization is that it leads to job outsourcing and data security issues. If you pay attention to the US elections, a lot of times presidents are talking about jobs leaving America and how that's a bad thing because it costs Americans the opportunity to have that job. Cool. There's also recently been a lot of talk around data security, especially when we think of hackers from certain countries stealing intellectual property. When everything's online, that's easy to do. All right. Let's talk about why should we care about international management and what it means to be successful. So why should we care? The first thing we just said, societies are becoming more interdependent. So there's more of a globalization in terms of organizations doing business in other countries, organizations working with organizations in other countries to be successful. That as a result, that means organizations are often working across borders. So a lot of the big firms have locations in America. They also have locations overseas. It's very common now to be asked to work in different locations around the world. Okay. That also means even if you're staying within the United States or your home country, you have to work with foreign customers or partners. You might be working with foreign employees or suppliers. What challenges do you think that represents if you are working with people from different cultures? Yeah, Mari? Yeah, that's scheduling is one. It's like, can we get on the same time with these different time zones, Cyrus? Yeah, that's a big takeaway from this chapter, is that different cultures have different preferences for communication. So if I'm an American and I'm loud and assertive and I don't shy away from conflict, and I'm working with somebody from a culture that is more communal and less assertive, that'll cause conflict, interpersonal conflict. Okay. Thanks, Cyrus. All right. Let's think about it from a management perspective. There are these two perspectives. The names aren't super important. The first is ethnocentric. That the idea behind that is that we know best. So if I'm going to go manage a site in France, for example, maybe France has their own way of doing things. If I'm American, I'm going to come in and I know what's best. So we're going to do things the American way. The opposite is to be polycentric. And the idea behind that is that they know best. So in that same situation, I would say, let me defer to the French employees. They know what's best here in this environment, so I'm not going to tell them what to do. Do y'all see pros and cons to both of those? There are, so I guess the question is, what are they? Yeah, Cutter? Yeah, he's saying we can't add on to what maybe they know is best, or they can't add on to what we think is best. So that's definitely the biggest drawback, is we're losing perspective that the opposite side could add to this situation. Any other thoughts? That's definitely the biggest con. All right, let's see if we can resolve the con. There's a third approach. This one is the one we want to shoot for. It's called geocentric. The only reason well, hold on that thought. So geocentric, the idea is that what's best is what's best regardless of the origin. So it kind of gets to Cotter's point about, if I'm going to go into France and say, we need to do this, but do you have any better ideas? Or do you see how that could be accommodated within your French environment? Or if I'm the home employee, if the French managers are coming over, they're going to say, all right, I know y'all do it this way in America. We're thinking maybe we bring this approach and we'll see how these two can be integrated together. Usually in these situations, and later on we'll talk about confrontation and how to resolve confrontation, but that's a separate chapter. We'll see that if we can integrate both sides, usually we'll find an optimal solution. Okay. The hard part for managers, especially managers that tend to take the first approach, is that they have an ego and they think, well, I know what's best, so we'll do it my way. And then they lose out on benefits of maybe the other side's got a better alternative. There is one test question off this slide. I might be extra credit. I have 10 extra credit questions, by the way. And it's something to the effect of, it's like true or false. Polycentric is deferring to others is the best way to approach international management. Deferring to others who are experts in that cultural context is the best way to approach it. And that sounds good, right? But the answer is false, because that's not geocentric. That's not accounting for what's best is what's best. Yeah, I said it's not geocentric, and that's what we're shooting for. Did I say it wrong still? All right. Well, to clarify, deferring to others is not always best. Geocentric is usually what's best. Well, it is what's best. Okay, anyways. So let's talk about why and how companies expand internationally. So first up, why? There's a lot of reasons we expand internationally as an organization. There's a lot of opportunities to be taken advantage of in international markets. The first is we can have greater availability to supplies. Sometimes supplies are cheaper in other countries. That'll be a form of outsourcing if I say, all right, let me find this raw product in this country where it's cheaper, and I'll import it back into where I'm at so I can use it for manufacturing. New markets also equal new customers. So just by the fact that if you have access to a new market, for example, China is a huge market because its population is so high. If you can get your product sold in China, automatically your customer base triples or even larger. Okay, lower labor costs. We talked about outsourcing jobs earlier. This is sometimes a pro and a con. It's a con if it's done unethically. So if you're paying people pennies on the dollar to do your job, that might not be ethical. All right, gives you access to financial capital and helps you avoid tariffs and import quotas. We'll talk about tariffs and import quotas a little later on. So I'm going to put a pin in that one. Let's look at how they expand. These are a few terms that you should be familiar with if you're not already. What I want to do is define these concepts, and then we'll talk about them from lowest risk to highest risk, and then we'll think about why is it important to understand which is lower and higher risk. Well, let's define the terms first. So outsourcing, this is one we probably should be familiar with already, is if we are using suppliers outside the company for goods or services. So we talked about outsourcing for jobs. That's a potential. We can outsource for materials for our supply chain. We can also outsource the labor entirely. We can say, all right, we're building cars in America, but it's cheaper to build the engines in Spain. So we're going to build the engines in Spain because that's cheaper. Okay. The important thing to think about is that when we're outsourcing, we're using a different company to provide us with something. All right, licensing is next. So one company allows another company to pay a fee to make or distribute the first company's product or service. Might not be the most easy way to think about that. Can y'all think of any products that are licensed? Sorry? Can we think of anything, doesn't have to be a car example, anything that's licensed? Guinness? Oh, they license that? I didn't know that. Drugs? I actually don't know how those are sold or if they're licensed. My example is going to be music. That's when we're all familiar with that process. Artists license their music to, for example, a stadium, and then the stadium can play the music, or the radio can play their music, but only if they pay a small fee for the license. Cool. So those are products that others are paying a small fee to either use or distribute. All right, franchising. So this is when one company allows another company to basically adopt the brand name and then be a part of that company. Chick-fil-A is a really good example. If you want to, you can create a Chick-fil-A franchise that you run and own and operate, even though it's still Chick-fil-A's brand and it's Chick-fil-A products. They let you become your own CEO, so to speak, of your franchise store. The cool thing I think about Chick-fil-A, at least when I looked 5 years ago, I did some research on the possibility of franchising, is that it's so competitive. Everybody wants to run a Chick-fil-A because they're so profitable that you have to apply. And if they select you, then they pay for everything. So if you get selected to run a store, they pay for the property, the inventory, the machinery. That's pretty cool. If you franchise another restaurant, a lot of times you're paying for the startup costs, but then they let you operate it. All right. The last example is a wholly owned subsidiary. And that's when a foreign subsidiary is totally owned and controlled by an organization. So as an example, Google is a subsidiary of Alphabet Inc. All right, so let's look at these from least risk to most risk. On the far left, we started with outsourcing, and on the far right, we have wholly owned subsidies. Can y'all take a guess why one's low risk and the other is high risk? Any guesses why outsourcing is relatively low risk compared to having a wholly owned subsidy? Cotter? Yeah, I think you're on the right track. So why is there less accountability with outsourcing? Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. So if we're giving this job to somebody else, if that person fails, then like that sucks for us, but at the end of the day, we're still fine. If we own a subsidiary and the subsidiary fails, that's high risk for us because that hurts our bottom line directly. Cool. That's really the main takeaway from this scale is that when we think about expanding our business, we have to balance how risky do we want to be? How much accountability do we want to take on for our own products and services? And we balance that with, would that be a good financial investment? All right, any questions here? All right, let's take a look at free trade. We'll talk about, well, what is free trade? What are barriers to free trade? What are trade blocks and exchange rates and BRICS? Let's talk about barriers to international trade. Before we talk about these, this actually isn't discussed in the book or on the slides. What are y'all's thoughts on the benefits of free trade? Like, why is that good? Yeah, Eric? Oh yeah, if we have free trade, if there's not tariffs or quotas or sanctions, it's easier to get stuff. Mari? Yes, it's profitable if you're exporting stuff. What about for the consumer? Why is free trade good? Ali? Costs? Yeah. If we can get products across the world, that'll increase competition. So different countries compete to make a better, cheaper product, and the consumer benefits at the end of the day because it's better and cheaper. So those are the positives. However, we know that free trade can hurt certain economies. Let's say that you're a poorer economy and you're trying to sell your product, and everyone in your country is buying your product from another country. That sucks for the manufacturers within your borders. So you might introduce tariffs, quotas, and sanctions to help benefit your own producers. Okay. Tariffs are taxed on imported goods. So if I am in America in the 1920s and I realize that China is selling steel that's cheaper and better, and no one's buying American steel, then I might put a tariff on Chinese steel so that people will be incentivized to purchase American steel. I'm basically making it more expensive to buy the competitor steel. Okay, import quotas are limits on number of imports. So I don't want that steel to flood my market. So I'll say, okay, we're only going to let in one boatload of steel every month. We'll limit the amount to which the product gets into our borders. Then last, sanctions and embargoes. So these are prohibitions on imports or trade. Typically, these are a result of poor international relations. If you think about Cuba and the United States, still to this day, there's some products that are not allowed to be traded back and forth between Cuba and the United States. Cuban cigars were a huge example for decades. It was illegal to bring Cuban cigars back to America. All right, so these are some of the barriers to international free trade. These are three organizations that promote international trade. I think One of these might be extra credit question on the midterm exam. Otherwise, it's not super important to know what these organizations do, but I would say it's good to know, or at least be familiar with who they are. These are pretty big players in the global community. So first is the World Trade Organization. Their purpose is to monitor and enforce trade agreements. The World Bank provides low-interest loans to developing nations, and the IMF assists in the smooth flow of money between nations. All right, let's keep going. So let's talk about major trading blocks. Blocks without a K, so BLOC. So a trading bloc is an economic community where nations will agree to favorable trade conditions with each other. In some cases, they'll agree to take away all tariffs and imports and embargoes and say, all right, free trade between us. Let's make a deal. There's a couple really famous ones. So NAFTA, which I believe is now called the USMCA. That's the free trade agreement between the North American countries, so Canada, United States, and America. The EU is a trade bloc in Europe, a European Union, which allows them to have favorable trade agreements and make it easier for people and products to cross borders. And then the TPP relates to the Pacific Rim countries. So that's their own trade bloc. Those are all just examples of trade blocs that have favorable trade agreements. Cool. All right, there's one term related to trade blocks. It's reserved for your best buddy of a country. So sometimes countries will become best buds and they'll call each other most favored nations, which means that we have special trade privileges between just the two of us. Cool. I'm just curious, does anyone in here want to go into policy for their career? All right, there's a lot of concepts that would relate to careers in policymaking or international relations. I don't want y'all to forget some of the main takeaways still apply to managers. And that is, well, what would y'all say for this? When we think about trade blocks and free trade, why do managers have to care about that? Or is there anything to be learned from talking about trade blocks as a manager? Mike? Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. So Mike's saying, if you're going to do business within another country, you have to know what's the trade agreement like between my country and their country. Thanks. All right, let's talk about exchange rate. We won't spend too much time on this because a lot of us grew up with a different currency than the USD. If you're not familiar, countries use different currencies and those are exchanged at different rates. So for example, if you have US dollars and Mexican pesos, one day you might be able to buy 20 pesos with $1, but then the next day, the American economy slips and now you can only buy 15 pesos with the same dollar. There are some people who day trade in exchange rates. So they'll buy pesos, for example, when pesos are doing really well, and then they'll sell them when they're doing very poorly. Cool. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about the BRICS. The BRICS are 5 major emerging economies, and each letter stands for these countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The reason these are important to think about is that they make up, just these 5 countries, 40% of the world's population. So just to be clear, they are not a trading bloc. There's no special agreement for the BRICS, but it's good to be aware if you're manufacturing a product and there's a possibility that you're going to be manufacturing and selling this product overseas, you might want to pay attention to what are the trends in these countries. It's like, what are the socio-cultural trends? What are the geopolitical trends that might influence your ability to do business here? And because they make up a large percentage of the world's population. All right, about some fun stuff. The culture, I think, is a fun topic to talk about because it's very different. So based on where we're raised, based on who our parents are, who our friends are, we have different cultural norms. They're instilled in us from a pretty early age. And once you've developed into a full-grown adult, you've pretty well established your cultural norms. Okay. Culture influences a lot of our life. So how we interact with others, how we interact in the workplace, how we respond to others' personalities. So what we'll do is we'll talk about different dimensions of cultural norms, like what makes an American different than, on average, than somebody from Germany. And then how, if we're managing in either of those contexts, how can we be aware of those differences to hopefully make it easier to work with people and avoid interpersonal conflict. All right, first up, about the importance, and then we'll talk about the dimensions. Actually, next up is the dimensions, so let's just look at those. There are, I think, 9 dimensions here. You do not need to know all of them. However, I think they're cool to look at and useful to know for your interpersonal dealings. The first one here is power distance. So one way that people can be different across cultures is their preference for equal versus unequal distribution of power. In America, we have a pretty low power distance preference, which means that I don't have any problem talking to my boss and telling my boss that I disagree. Generally speaking, not all Americans are like that. In China, do you think they have a high or low power distance? High. Yeah, someone said high. Who said that? Okay. I'm assuming you're not from China. You are? Oh, okay. All right. If you grew up in China, you might realize or have found that if you're talking to a parent or a supervisor, by default, we treat them with more respect and deference than maybe an American would to their parent or supervisor. They have a preference for higher power distance. Cool. All right, next up, uncertainty avoidance. So how well do we tolerate uncertainty? In some countries, in general, again, these are all general statements. This is not true for everybody. But in general, in certain countries, people really get stressed out when they're not sure about what's coming next. Whereas in other countries, they're more laid back and they go with the flow. Okay. Institutional collectivism, similar to in-group collectivism. Basically, how much do we identify with a group? So with institutional collectivism, are we loyal to a social unit? And with in-group collectivism, that's more about taking pride in your friends and family. So I know a lot of Eastern cultures, like China especially, they have higher in-group collectivism because they're more concerned about like taking pride and supporting their family, more so than maybe an American citizen who's more individualistic and more concerned about what's best for themselves. All right, gender egalitarianism. Do we have equal rights for all genders? Egalitarianism is equality, essentially. Assertiveness, how dominant or competitive are we? How willing are we to engage in heated debate? Future orientation is the extent to which we want to plan for the future versus being more concerned about the present moment. Performance orientation, how much do we emphasize improvement and excellence? And then humane orientation is more about altruism, kindness, and fairness. Do y'all know what altruism means? Can anyone define that for us real quick? I didn't learn that till college, so I'm curious if y'all know that. Sophia? Yeah, that's exactly it. So altruism is I'll self-sacrifice for the benefit of somebody else. I'm more concerned about their well-being than my own well-being. Cool. All right, so a question for y'all. How would you, or how might you expect a manager from the United States to violate one or more of these dimensions in another culture? Sorry? What would they be bad at? So like they go into another culture and they violate some norm. Amari, what you got? Yeah, so I gave an example earlier, power distance. If I go to a high power distance culture and I start to challenge my boss, I'm probably just going to get fired. Any other thoughts? Sophia? Okay. Do you have any specific examples in mind? Yeah, I agree with you. That's a really good example. I'll share a personal example. So my PhD program is mostly international students, mostly from China. And if we have a house party, for example, if I invite the other students over, they always bring gifts because they're more about I don't know, doing things for others within their social group. And if I go to their place and forget to bring a gift, I feel like a huge tool because I didn't bring a gift. It's very interesting for us to talk about, like, hey, is that normal in your country? And if no, then okay, let's maybe make an exemption. All right. One of the things I was curious to know is if y'all have any thoughts from your own personal culture, things we haven't talked about. Because I know we have a lot of students from other cultures aside from America here. Any things that y'all see from your own culture that you see violated often, or that leads to interpersonal conflict for you? Maybe in your own personal life, you see these things on a daily basis and it frustrates you because you see what's a norm in your culture violated in here or elsewhere. Eileen? Yeah, that's really good. So that's work-life balance. Where would y'all put that up here? Maybe performance orientation or I don't know, humane orientation? Yeah, I could see that too. That's a really good example. So work-life balance is very different here in other places. Carissa? Yeah. Do you see that up here anywhere? So tattoos. I agree with you. That could definitely be a cultural norm that could be violated. Just to be clear, there are way more dimensions than these 9. So I would create a probably different dimension and put that in there. Maybe like personal appearance. In some cultures, it's considered, what's the word I'm looking for? Unclean to have a tattoo or I forget the word, but yeah. All right, I want to show you the next slide because it's got some cool examples of where different countries fall on these dimensions. We're not going to spend time going through each one of these. You can look at it later if you want. But just for example, with power distance, some of the highest countries here, Morocco, Argentina, Thailand, Spain, Russia. Some of the lowest include Denmark, Netherlands, South Africa, Israel, and Costa Rica. Cool. Assertiveness is another interesting one. Germany, US, Spain, those are high assertiveness. Sweden, New Zealand, Switzerland, Japan, Kuwait, those are low assertiveness. This one's also interesting. So gender egalitarianism. So a lot of these countries in Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, Denmark, Sweden, a lot of those are high in gender egalitarianism. Those are also a lot of the countries ranked high in happiness in that Finland study. Cool. All right, let's keep going. In addition to those dimensions, I mentioned there were others that we can differentiate cultures on. These are just a couple other big examples: language, interpersonal space, communication. Oh, here we go. I think Island's example relates to time orientation. So do we want to leave work at 5 or do we want to stay past 5? Religion, that might influence Chris's example of getting tattoos or not getting tattoos. And then law and political stability. I like this chart as well because it based on a research study that shows what's the preferred distance for interpersonal like body space. So if you look at Saudi Arabia, for example, they prefer a social distance of 4.2 feet. That means if you get closer than 4.2 feet, you're going to make them uncomfortable. So if you are, let's say, looks like US has one of the smallest preferences for social distance. Let's say you like to get close to someone to talk to them, and you do that in Saudi Arabia, you might offend somebody. That's good to be aware of. You think it's closer than that? Oh, nice. Yeah, this is a study with like, they just took a big sample of people and asked them, and this was the average. There's also individual preference that goes into that, but that's a good point. All right. Here's another cool figure related to religion. So this is, well, this is a breakdown of the different religions by population. It might be good to know if you're going into another country, what are the religious, well, so what's the dominant religion for one thing? And then what are some outcomes of that religion you might need to be aware of? So for example, correct me if I'm wrong, the Hindus will not eat cow meat. Is that correct? All right. So we think that's correct. So if you're McDonald's and you're selling burgers or you're selling McDonald's in a country that has a lot of Hindus, you might not want to sell cow meat in your burgers. You might advertise something else, create a new product for that market. All right. Any questions on that? Cultural differences. The last thing we'll do when we do our career readiness section, we'll talk about ways to develop your cultural competency. So we'll come back to that later on. Let's see, next thing. I want to go ahead and do our self-assessment. Let's take 5 minutes to complete our self-assessment. Make sure you hit submit and make sure you hit share or not share your results so that you get credit for completing the assessment. All right, does anyone need more time with this? Anybody still working? All right, Eric, hurry up. Just kidding. All right, let's go ahead and regroup. We'll discuss the results of our self-assessment. All right, so I have a couple of questions for y'all related to your self-assessment. First, anybody get a lower score than they expected to? Okay, good. Seems like we're all very self-aware then. That's good. Next question. What are some ways we can improve our global managing potential? Even if we're really good already, what are some ways we can get better? Yeah. Okay, how do you do that? Research? Okay, you can do your own research. If you're going to travel somewhere, maybe you look up in advance. What is it like there? What are the norms? Mike? Yeah, how do you develop that? Yeah, so I should have done my research, is what you're saying. Yeah, that's good. If we want to do better and have respect for them, that's going to go a long way as well. Any other thoughts on how we can get better? Brenda? God, dang. All right. Yes. Yes. That's, yeah, that's probably one of the best things you can do is ask them. That also shows that you care about learning and not violating their norms. If you just say like, hey, what's appropriate in this situation? That goes a long way. All right. Here's some examples. We hit on some of these already. Something we didn't talk about, you can take courses in international business and economics in addition to social issues. Is that a class y'all take, international business or anything like that? I don't know what classes y'all take. Sorry? Global marketing? Yeah, that seems relevant. Okay. Take opportunities to study, live, visit abroad, where a lot of UIC students are studying abroad. So kudos to y'all. If you were born and raised in America and you have a chance to go study abroad, you should take advantage of that. And also, kind of like what Mike said, just developing cultural competency. We'll actually talk about that as our next point. So our career readiness competency is cultural competency. Have y'all heard the term cultural intelligence? Yeah, you might have. It's very similar to IQ. They actually call it CQ, cultural quotient. That's what the Q stands for. And it's basically developing your knowledge of different norms and different cultures, how to interact with people from different cultures. It's a super useful skill, especially in an increasingly globalized market. So let's talk about some ideas to improve. First is to listen and observe. So if you go to a foreign country or you find yourself in a foreign culture, try to take the perspective of somebody who was born and raised there. So don't assume that the way that you do things is correct. Also, just like be quiet and listen. So see how do they interact in social situations, see how they talk to each other, see what kind of physical space they give each other. And you can start to model that so that you avoid violating their cultural norms. Next up, be aware of the context. So context refers to the situation or environmental characteristics that influence our behavior. So learn to kind of read the cues within the context. Read and adapt to the structure, rules, customers, and leaders in an unfamiliar situation. And then last, so choose something basic, like learning another language. If you can speak 2 languages, That's a super marketable skill when you're interviewing for jobs. Cool. And then, as Norelli said, so even if you just try to show that you're making an effort by asking, that's going to go a long way. All right. I would like to do one group activity with our teams. What I want to do in just a sec, don't move just yet. Let me explain. We're going to find our teams from our group projects. We'll sit in the same spot we sat when we met as a group. And then we'll learn about each other's culture. So learn something about your teammates' culture that might help your teamwork. So let's meet with our groups. We'll spend about 10 minutes doing this. Yeah, what group are you in? Do you remember? I'll look it up for you. All right, I'll tell you your group in just a sec. You're Brigitte? Brigitte? All right, so your group's 7. And I think group 7 is back there. Oh, you're also group 7. Yeah, so the far back right side of the room should be group 7. Just ask when you get back there if they're group 7.
Thursday because I was sick. I don't know who my team.
I'll look it up for you. Can you tell me your name?
Janai.
Your group 9. Group 9 should be the back left corner. Yep, all the way in the back. All right, so discuss as a group, learn about each other's culture. We'll take 10 minutes.
The city area. Explore all of them. All right,
Let's regroup. Seems like most groups have had a chance to share. We're not going to have a formal group discussion. That was for y'all's benefit. However, I'm curious if anybody is willing to and or eager to share anything interesting they've learned. Something unique about your teammates, or maybe something that'll help your teamwork. All right. That's good. Let me come to you in just a second, Brian. Is there a single team where everyone's from one country? Yeah, that's not surprising. Yeah, that sounds nice. You said Vietnamese culture? Nice, very cool. One of the guys in my cohort is from, he's from China, and he put an offer on a house in Chicago, and I was like, what the hell? Because they don't pay us a lot. He said, yeah, my parents gave me money for this, for the down payment for this condo. Oh, that's pretty awesome. I think that's common in China as well. All right, any other fun facts you want to share? Eileen? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example of a lower power distance. So I don't care if y'all don't call me doctor. Well, for one thing, I'm not a doctor. But there also are individual differences. So some professors, you better call them doctor or they're going to get pissed off. Yeah, Henry? Yeah. I've heard there are different angles of bow. Is that correct? Based on how much you're respecting that person or deferring to that person. That's cool. You know, a fun fact of why the handshake became popular in America is that in the old Western days, you would shake hands to show that you didn't have a gun in your hand. You present an open hand. Oh, that's what I've heard. I don't know if that's true. All right. Any other fun things we want to share with the group? Those are all really cool. Sounds like we had some good discussions. All right. Well, if not, I'm going to put up the attendance slide. So we'll finish a little early today. Don't forget to do your case analysis. Submit the self-assessment by tonight. And I'll see y'all Thursday for chapter 5. I don't know. I'll figure out when I review it. I've taught this class twice, but I usually just review the night before. All right. See y'all Thursday. What's up? We did not last Thursday. Yeah, good question. Yep.